Badwater was destined to take his place in the Southern Episcopal hierarchy. Instead, he met my mother in the village at the start of his senior year in our lone dry-cleaning establishment. She had come down from the very top of Morgan's Mountain to make a little money and see a little life, and all his fine passion fled the church in a rush and poured into her. They were married by the New Year, and I appeared in the earliest days of New Green May. I was a quiet child who absorbed a great deal of grown-up talk, and while I was still small, I came to know that my mother and father had done it practically the day they met and whenever after they could. I knew what it was, too, vaguely. I heard them so often whispering and laughing, and then breathing in that sharp, short way, and finally moaning and shouting aloud, that I ceased to be curious and never even bothered to spy on them. I truly believe that they loved each other profoundly, as well as lusted after each other, and much of that love overflowed onto me. We were a happy little family, even though both sets of my grandparents predicted nothing for us but ruin. My father managed to graduate from Trinity, though his grades were flaccid and his ambition flown, and after commencement, he simply stayed on in Montview and got a job at the hardware store. By the time I was 5, they still had not let up much and had become adventurous in their choice of arenas. I was old enough to lift from sleep and bundle into the back seat of their old Nash. They would range the mountain on moonlit nights, and when they found a spot that was inviting, they simply stopped the Nash, made sure I was asleep, and got out and did it under the cold smile of the moon. The old chain-hung bridge over Tolliver's Creek was daunting even in daylight. It hung a good 50 feet in midair over the white, rushing water below. But it must have swayed gently and irresistibly before them that June night, because they parked the Nash on the far side and went off onto the middle of the bridge and took off their clothes and began to make love. And it was in the final blinded and deafened transports of love that Leon Crouch, drunk in his father's chicken truck, caromed onto the bridge and smashed them off it and onto the granite rapids below. I did not hear the truck coming. I did not hear it hit them. I only heard, an instant later, the squall of brakes and Leon Crouch shouting over and over, "Holy shit! Oh, holy shit, fire Jesus Lord!" And then, when he found me in the back seat of the Nash, God damn those trashy fuckers, right in front of their baby. It was as good an epitaph as any for Rose Ellen and Cornelius Compton in the eyes of the mountain. Trinity College crowns the flat summit of Morgan's Mountain in South Tennessee like a mortarboard. It was modeled after the venerable Anglican colleges of England. The education is inalterably classical liberal arts and generally first-rate in spite of it. The Trinity experience no longer fits one to live anywhere but Trinity, it's often said at faculty doings. But those who remain do not wish to leave. Much of Trinity's power lies in its beauty. The mountain and the village of Montview are almost phantasmagorical in their loveliness. There are to me no mountains on earth so beautiful as these. They are among the oldest in the world, smoothed now to the curves of a sleeping woman's body. Trinity is eccentric and elitist and chauvinistic and innocent and arrogant and very, very particular. My grandfather Cash was a janitor there. He used to clean the structure that bore my other grandfather's name. Not for long, Papaw Cash refused to enter Compton Seminary with his mops and brooms once the Compton of it entered his family. Everyone at Trinity understood. Joe was powerfully attracted to my family's bizarre history. "It's pure American tragedy," he said over and over. "It's all of folklore and literature, really. The Montagues and the Capulets. Most of Faulkner." I was in Joe's senior literature seminar. It was how we met. He knew the story of my provenance. Everyone at Trinity did. I had stopped minding long before. Such was Trinity's ecclesiastical, liberal artsy predilection for wounded birds that I was a campus favorite from the days I used to come to work with my grandfather Cash and sat docilely on the steps of whatever structure he was cleaning, Mamaw Cash being practically certifiable by then. Somehow, I never felt an outsider in the domain, and I suppose that I was an appealing child. I heard it often. I was slight and grave and long-limbed, and had a cap of curls like a little Greek boy's, only fair and fine, thin features. I looked for all the world like my father, and still do, save for the very dark eyes that were my mother's. After a while, Mrs. Pierce, the provost's wife, put her foot down and said that it was a disgrace for Bishop Compton's great-granddaughter to sit out on the steps with the mops and brooms all day, and brought me into her own house. I pretty much grew up there weekdays. I went up to the little Trinity kindergarten, and then Montview Day. I know that my Compton grandparents paid my tuition and probably kicked in a good bit more in those earliest days. I know that if they'd sent money to my Cash grandparents' house, Mamaw Cash would have given it all to her church. She was practically handling snakes by that time. I never knew why my grandparents were so cold and angry. It was not entirely at my father and mother's shameful death, for they were silent and angry before that. My grandmother was a religious fanatic from the day she was converted by a hellfire-screaming, circuit-riding preacher near her 16th birthday. By the time my grandfather began taking me to work with him, she was so deeply possessed by the Holy Ghost that even he, stone-cold man that he was himself, feared she would harm me if I were left alone with her. She murdered one of Papaw's 2 prized heifers because her God demanded of her, one steaming July day, the sacrifice of a fatted calf. Then she went after the social worker from the county who heard about the calf and came to see how I was faring. Only the intervention of the pastor of her church, and my grandfather's promise to keep me away from her, saved her from being committed then and there to the state mental facility in Knoxville. The next morning I went for the first time up the winding road to Trinity College with my grandfather in his old truck, and passed for the first time under the arch and into the domain. Yes, that small part of me deep inside whispered, "This is right. This is the place." I told Joe everything about me soon after we met, except the manner of my parents' death. I told him finally on a day when he asked me to go with him down off the mountain and over to Chattanooga to hear an organ concert in one of the big Episcopal churches there. "I have all the God up here I need," I said finally. "I don't need a dose of anybody else's." "Cat," Joe said, "why don't you leave this mountain? What are you afraid of?" And so I told him. And he wept. And I knew then that I would marry him if he would ask me, and that he probably would. And he did, not long after that day. I fell in love with him on the first day of his seminar, in the winter of my senior year. His eyes were blue and full of a kind of swimming light behind the round wire glasses, and his features were narrow and sharp and tanned. We had heard that he was considered a great asset to Trinity. "My name is Joe Gilliard," he said. "Josiah Peabody Gilliard. The Josiah and the Peabody are Vermont Yankee from back to Adam, but the Gilliard is a Cajun merchant marine who met my mother in Boston on her high school class trip and married her 3 hours before I was born. I just figured I'd get things off on the right foot and let you guys know you didn't have the lock on Gothic down here." We laughed, and I was lost. I married him on the afternoon of my graduation from Trinity, in austere little St. Rhoda's Chapel. I wore a simple white eyelet dress that Cora Pierce had married in, and wildflowers from the steep in my hair, and Joe wore his Dartmouth hood over his Trinity gown. Student-faculty relations were forbidden, but Joe was Trinity's first golden boy from the Ivy League, and I was their poster child. And Joe melted any incipient resistance by simply going to Dr. Pierce, still our provost and my unofficial guardian since the death of both sets of my grandparents, and formally declaring his honorable intentions toward me. I had been living with the Pierces since my Cash grandparents died in the final fire set in the old house by Mad Mattie Cash.